Aus welchem Grund ist die Unterstützung der Ukraine für die USA und die EU so wichtig? Geht es wirklich darum, unsere Werte zu verteidigen, wie europäische Politiker behaupten?
Why is supporting Ukraine so important to the US and the EU? Is it really about defending our values as European politicians claim?
Well, you're right to refer to European politicians because nobody else believes it. If you look around the world, almost the entire world, the entire global south is just laughing hysterically at this pretension of the West to be upholding values. They have had plenty of experience with Western values for recent years, many centuries. If you want to know what the values of governments and diplomats are, you don't listen to what they say, you look at what they do. So take Germany, since we're talking there, take arms sales. Where do German arms sales go? You can look it up on the internet. Last year, German arms sales hit new records. The leading recipient of German arms sales was Egypt, the most brutal dictatorship in Egypt's ugly history. 60,000 political prisoners, every form of torture and abuse. That's German values. Take a look at France. Main recipient of French arms is United Arab Emirates, another noble country with a marvelous record of internal freedom and foreign benevolence, like participating in the destruction of Yemen, the worst humanitarian crisis in the current world, according to the United Nations. I won't even mention the United States. There is a joke. The leading recipients of U.S. arms and aid, far ahead of any others, are Israel, secondly, Egypt. Israel has a horrendous human rights record, political record. Egypt, I've already talked about. Furthermore, this goes way back. In case of the United States, I haven't been following it closely for years. Putting aside Israel and Egypt, a separate category, almost invariably, the leading recipient of U.S. military aid is one of the leading human rights violators. So in the 1990s, Turkey was carrying out horrible slaughters of Kurds, its own Kurdish population, tens of thousands killed, thousands of towns and villages destroyed, hundreds of thousands of refugees needed arms. So it reached the top of U.S. arms sales. As atrocities peaked, arms sales went with them. Well, that's only one index, but it's a typical one. That's what European values are. Ukraine has, the rest of the world is quite correct to be basically ridiculing these pretensions.
Der deutsche Bundeskanzler Olaf Scholz bezeichnete den Angriff Russlands als Zeitenwende. War es wirklich ein historischer Wendepunkt? Und welche Art von Weltordnung wird aus diesem tragischen Krieg hervorgehen?
The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz called the Russian invasion a Zeitenwende, like a turning point. Was it really a historical turning point? And what kind of world order will arise from the tragic war?
Well, I think it is a turning point, Zeitenwendung. It's probably coming. Apart from the criminality of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it was also criminally stupid from Russia's point of view. it handed over to the United States its most welcome gift on a silver platter, namely Europe. Going back some years into the Second World War, there have been complete competing conceptions of the role that Europe should play in world affairs. One of them is the so-called Atlanticist conception, basically NATO-based, run by the United States. Europe as a subordinate. Another one, which was associated primarily with Charles de Gaulle, was that Europe should be an independent third force in world affairs, as it certainly could be, given its resources, scale, capacities, and so on. The effect of the invasion is to provide substance to the Atlanticist vision, to drive Europe into Washington's pocket, Washington's greatest gift. Terrible outcome for Russia, of course. Now, the next question is, can it last? It's for Europe to hang on to Washington's coattails means to decline, possibly to deindustrialize, to lose its potential position in the global system, even economically. The fact of the matter, like it or not, is that Europe and Russia are very natural partners. Economists describe it as a marriage made in heaven. Russia doesn't have much of an economy. Its economy is about the level of Mexico, but it has enormous resources. Western Europe, especially German-based, the whole German-based system from Netherlands to Slovakia, depends very heavily on minerals, oil, other resources that Russia has in abundance. It's a very natural partnership. It'll be very hard to break. We can see the problems right now. Also, from Europe's point of view, failure to accommodate with Russia means being substantially cut off from the enormous China-based system that's developing through Eurasia. Europe is going to have to make an essential decision. Does it want to remain subordinate to the US within the Atlanticist NATO framework, facing decline, possible deindustrialization, or does it want to move towards something like the Gaullist Gorbachev vision of a European common home, with Europe being a major independent force in world affairs? These are big choices.
Haben Sie in Ihrer langen Karriere jemals erlebt, dass ein Land und seine Regierung so verteufelt wurde wie Russland? Und warum wurden die USA, welche in ihrer Geschichte mehrere völkerrechtswidrige Invasionen geführt haben, nie in dieser Art geächtet?
In your long career, have you ever seen a country and its leadership being demonized as much as Russia? And why was the US, which committed several invasions in violation of international law, never ostracized like that?
Well, several times in history is a bit of an understatement. The US has been at war, an aggressive war, almost entire history. But yes, in recent years, the United States has carried out major crimes: invasion of Iraq, invasion and destruction of Indochina, terrorist wars in Central America. We can go on and on. But when the United States carries out huge atrocities from Europe's point of view, it's us against them. That's not a crime. That's Europe's whole history. Savage destruction of, go back to Adam Smith 250 years ago, and was bitterly condemning what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans in the rest of the world. Well, that was at the beginning of a process of massacre and destruction that goes on right up to the present. Can talk about it, but so when the United States participates in it, it's just more of the same. The United States wants to destroy Iraq. Okay, we don't like it, but maybe we can make some money out of it. Quite different when someone attacks white Europeans. That's very different, very close by. But let's not make any pretenses about high values. As for the demonization of Russia, remember that that's a restricted phenomenon. That's Europe and the Anglosphere, the English-speaking countries. Look around the rest of the world, it's not happening. I don't know what was reported in the German press, but there was a huge, great euphoria in American press and scholarly circles because India broke with Russia. Well, India broke. The basis for that claim was a meeting between Prime Minister Modi of India and Vladimir Putin in Samarkand, where Modi said, "War is not the way." That was taken in the United States to be a break between India and Russia. I took the trouble to look up the Indian government official website. He did say those words, and then he continued with what was practically a love poem saying Russia and India have very warm historical relations. We're expanding them. We're working together even more than in the past to create a peaceful and just world. It was a love letter. There's a lot of deceit. You have to be pretty careful. And what India was saying is not that different from much of the rest of the world, Indonesia, Africa, many other places. So the demonization is a European Anglosphere phenomenon. And I think it would be interesting to look into this, but my impression is it's mostly an elite phenomenon. I don't know if that's true of public opinion. From what I've seen of polls and other information, it seems much more nuanced. But it's perfectly true that in elite circles, intellectual circles, journals, there's tremendous demonization of Russia. In fact, Graham Fuller, who's a leading U.S. Intelligence official, he was top of U.S. intelligence for 20 years, working mostly with Russia, said recently that he's never seen such demonization of Russia in his entire career as a top intelligence official. However, it's not really that unusual in U.S. history. Sometimes even on small things. So, for example, when France refused to go along with the US invasion of Iraq, the Senate dining room changed French fries to freedom fries. Can't eat French fries because they refused to go along with us in the world's most major international crime in this century, invasion of Iraq. You want more? Take a look at what happened during the First World War. The demonization of Germany in the United States was utterly extraordinary and was quite way beyond what we're seeing today. And it was interesting because it had been a pacifist population which had no interest in war. When Woodrow Wilson decided to go to war, set off a major propaganda operation, the first propaganda agency in US history, which within a year had turned the country into raving anti-German hysterics. Boston Symphony Orchestra couldn't play Beethoven. You couldn't eat Frankfurters. They have to be hot dogs. It goes on and on. Demonization of the Chinese happens all the time. It's a pathology in the United States. Goes way back to some extent in Europe. A lot of it, I suspect, is racist in origin. But it's true, demonization of Russia, at least among elites in Europe and the United States, has reached a pretty remarkable level. As you say, the United States carries out much worse atrocities all the time, but that's fine because that's us against them. That's our métier, is slaughtering people in the third world.
Viele europäische Länder leiden wegen des Wirtschaftskriegs zwischen ihren Regierungen und Russland. In Deutschland verlangten einige Politiker von ihren Wählern sogar, für die Ukraine zu frieren. Würden die Amerikaner eine solche Aufforderung ihrer Regierung akzeptieren, für ein anderes Land zu frieren?
Many European countries suffer because of the economic war waged between the governments and Russia. In Germany, some politicians even demanded from their voters to freeze for Ukraine. Would the American people accept such demands from their leadership to freeze for another country?
Well, the question has never arisen because the United States has a history very different from Europe. The United States has always been victorious. Wars are something that go on somewhere else. The United States gains from them. During the Second World War, for example, Europe destroyed itself. The US had an enormous economic boom under the state-directed economy. Manufacturing quadrupled during the Second World War. I'm old enough to remember it. There was a little restrictions. You weren't allowed to drive more than 35 miles an hour, a few things like that. There was a little bit of rationing, but nothing like what the rest of the world suffered. And exactly the same is true right now. Europe is freezing. Europe is facing decline, possibly even deindustrialization. Remember, Europe depends on Russia for more than gas flows, depends on Russia for minerals. If Europe wants to move to sustainable energy, it's going to need Russian minerals. The manufacturing requires minerals that Russia produces. This is a very natural accommodation. It's going to be very hard to break. Meanwhile, the US is benefiting enormously when liquefied natural gas flows from the United States, now the major producer, to Europe. It's an enormous boon for American fossil fuel industry, arms industry, of course. In fact, the profits in fossil fuel industries, military industries, the banks that fund them, they're just profits are exploding. It's a large part of the source of inflation in the United States. So for the masters of the economy, it's extremely profitable, the current war. The population, that's different, but it's always different. When we talk about benefits, we talk about for those who own and run the place, not the general population. They may suffer from it. So would the United States tolerate something like this? As I say, there's nothing in history to indicate how it might, because the question has never come up throughout its entire history.
Eines der ausgegebenen Ziele von Russlands sogenannter Militäroperation ist eine Entnazifizierung der Ukraine. Westliche Regierungen und Medien argumentieren, dass die Ukraine kein Faschismusproblem hat, unter anderem, weil der Präsident ein Jude sei. Was halten Sie von den Äußerungen beider Seiten?
One of the stated objectives in Russia's so-called special military operation is the denazification of Ukraine. Western governments and media argue that Ukraine can't have a fascism problem since the president is of Jewish origin. What do you make of the statements from either side?
The fact that Zelensky is of Jewish origin doesn't really bear on the matter. The United States had a black president a couple of years ago, but has no effect on racism in the United States. It remains virulent, as you can see. I think this issue it's not non-existent, but I think it's greatly exaggerated. There are a lot of things wrong with Ukraine, but there's an overriding fact. They are the victim of a completely unjustified criminal invasion. That's the overriding fact. The denazification is not a central issue. When you look at the Russian demands right up to the invasion, they were for neutralization and demilitarization. The neutralization is an old issue. And if the United States and Europe had agreed to that, I think the war could have possibly been inverted. What it would mean, the neutralization would mean, in effect, that Ukraine would have roughly the status that Austria had during the whole Cold War period. Didn't interfere with Austrian sovereignty. For that matter, the effect that Mexico has. It's not a formal requirement, but everyone is perfectly aware that Mexico can't join a hostile military alliance run by China, for example. It'd be inconceivable. So neutralization could have been achieved. Demilitarization is a matter that could be taken up in negotiations. What does it mean? It could mean, for example, that Ukraine would not have heavy weapons aimed at Russia, just as Mexico can't have weapons aimed at the United States. That's not even conceivable. The Minsk agreements were not implemented. They could have been pursued, maybe in some modified form, up to the point of the invasion. These were options that were lost.
Der ehemalige ukrainische Botschafter in Deutschland, Andriy Melnik, wurde in diesem Sommer scharf kritisiert, als er den Nazi-Kollaborateur Stepan Bandera in einem Interview öffentlich verteidigte. Nun ist er neuer Vize-Außenminister der Ukraine. Selbst die Europäische Union beklagte 2010 in einem Beschluss eine neue Bandera-Verehrung in der Ukraine. Widerspricht es nicht dem proklamierten Kampf gegen faschistisches Gedankengut, wenn westliche Länder nun Milliarden von Euros und Waffen in ein Land geben, in dem eine beträchtliche Minderheit dem Nazi-Kollaborateur anhängt?
The former Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, Andriy Melnik, got into hot water this summer when he publicly defended Stepan Bandera in an interview. Now he is the new Vice Foreign Minister of Ukraine. Even the European Parliament condemned the glorification of Bandera in Ukraine in a resolution back in 2010. Doesn't it contradict the self-proclaimed fight against fascist ideology when Western countries pour in billions of euros and weapons into a country where there is a sizable minority which follows the Bandera cult?
If the US, Europe, Germany had any interest in fighting fascist ideas, they wouldn't be supporting basically fascist governments all over the world. I mentioned already that Germany's prime, the major recipient of US arms exports, is the Egyptian dictatorship, which is a basically fascist dictatorship. Help US arms sales, same sort of story, and other activities as well. These are not European and Western values. We should stop pretending that. Take Saddam Hussein, one of the major criminals of the modern age. He was the darling of the Reagan administration. He carried out his worst atrocities, like the chemical warfare against Kurds and Iraqi Kurds. was carried out with American support. The United States even denied that he was doing it, tried to blame Iran. The end of the Iraq-Iran war, George W. Bush, first H.W. Bush, the first Bush, invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for advanced training in weapons production. This is Saddam Hussein, and they loved him. It was where his worst, all the crimes for which he was later condemned, they were carried out with strong US support. There's no values. Let's stop pretending. There's no fighting against fascist values. It's perfectly true that there's a proto-fascist element in Ukraine, in Russia, in Germany, in the United States. Yes, it's there, but that's not the reason that the war is continuing. It's not the major factor.